All right. Hello, everybody. I know for those of you, Happy New Year, Academic New Year anyway. We're kicking off with an expert discussion regarding critical thinking tests, breaking down the MCAT CARS and the DAT Reading Comprehension sections. We're doing this in partnership with Booster Prep. And so thank you guys so much. Charmaine, hopefully, we'll start with Charmaine and then we'll introduce you to Pahul in a second. So thank you guys so much for co-hosting this session.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having us as well. Pahul, if you don't mind pulling up the slides.
Oh, yes. Oh, sorry, it's being... Oh.
We'll get there in just a second. So hopefully we'll see what we can do. So we'll have him a little bit in the background and so forth. So as we kind of get more people in, we really welcome your questions for this session. I know many of you are thinking about preparing for your major upcoming exams for next application cycle. So this is about the right time to really start looking at what assets you have for preparing for the MCAT, the DAT, or the OAT. And again, we're really glad to partner with Booster Prep to really help all of those of you who are very much in the beginning of your preparation to get an idea of what sort of things to think about, especially when it comes to the critical thinking tests, such as the MCAT CARS and the reading comprehension section for the DAT, and I believe the OAT as well. So, all right, now we have our slides up. And so thank you guys. Charmaine, I'll just go throw it to you.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Chuck. So, hi everybody, my name is Charmaine. I'm the marketing director and one of the test prep presenters at Booster Prep. So we also have our MCAT and DAT expert, Pahul, here. So I'm gonna let him do a quick introduction.
Yeah, hello everybody. My name is Pahul. I am a first-year medical student here at the University of Calgary. I was interested in both dentistry and medicine, and I've written both the DAT and the MCAT. And I'm happy to be helping future students on their journey towards healthcare professions.
All right, perfect. So let's quickly go over the agenda for today so everybody knows what they're in for. All right. So today we're just going to start off with some really quick introductions. We've already covered our own introductions, and then I'm just going to quickly talk about what we do at Booster Prep to really help you, especially for the MCAT and DAT. That's going to be really short and sweet, and then I'll hand things over to Pahul to really talk about, the CARS section and also the reading comprehension section of the DAT. We're going to wrap things up with some final comparisons between these two exams and some advice for you. Then we'll do a quick Q&A where we can answer your questions. All right, so let's get into it. Okay, so I'm going to start us off with a really quick introduction of what we do at Booster Prep. So if you have any pre-dental or pre-optometry friends, they've most likely heard of us, probably through DAT Booster and Oat Booster. And here are all of the products that we currently offer. We essentially provide study tools to help students prepare for various high-stakes exams in the healthcare field. And we basically cover everything from content learning to practice exams. All right, so on to the next slide. Now I just want to quickly cover how we're really involved in helping you prepare for the MCAT and DAT. And I want to start off with something really exciting. So this is a free tool under our newest resource called MCAT Booster. And it's a Chrome extension that works on all AAMC practice exams. So it basically reloads your exam review page into the MCAT interface with improved solutions. And you don't need a subscription. So just go to the link over here or just search up MCAT Booster, maybe on Google, and you can download it for free. All right, and now let's move on to our platforms for the two exams we're covering today. So we're gonna start with CARS Booster. Last year, we released CARS Booster for the CARS section of the MCAT to really give students a brand new way to prepare for CARS through games. And that's because we truly believe that you can practice and improve on CARS with more than just passages and tests. And we also really want to help you maintain consistency through your MCAT prep without burning out, because that does happen. And as you all know, CARS really isn't about memorization, so we really wanted to focus on the real solution, which is training the skills and the logic that you need to do well in CARS. So that's why we created this tool. And quickly moving on to DAT Booster. So I'm sure a lot of you have already heard about it. So instead of going through the whole platform, just going to touch on a few updates from us. We've increased our practice tasks and questions. We've added a custom study schedule, so it can be created based on your own start date and exam date. And we also have new performance reports that give you score predictions across all of the sections, your percentile, academic average, and all that great stuff. And since we're talking about DAT reading comprehension today, I'm just going to end off my introduction with a really quick look at what we offer for DAT reading comprehension. So we have practice tests, question banks, videos that teach you how to succeed in this section, strategy guides that you can read through, recommended articles. So this is for improving your reading. And lastly, performance analytics that really break down how you're performing on your practice tests and what you need to work on for a higher score. So without further ado, I'm now going to pass it over to our expert Pahul to start you off with an overview of CARS. Thank you, Pahul.
All right, thank you for that introduction. So I'm Pahul, and today I'll just be going through sort of the CARS section. I'll do a walkthrough of a passage, and then we can go through the DAT RC section, and I have some questions prepped for that as well. And then I can sort of do a quick comparison. So starting off with MCAT CARS, I know for a lot of students, it's pretty daunting. And I know a lot of students also retake the exam because of MCAT CARS. Canadian medical schools especially, they very heavily value MCAT CARS. This is a bit of hope. I took the MCAT twice. I got a 126 the first time, and I improved on it. So some of these tips are things that work for me. They might not work for you, but it's just another perspective, another way of looking at things. And so a quick overview here. So MCAT CARS has 53 questions and 9 passages, and approximately 5 to 7 questions per passage. It's a 90-minute section, so 5 minutes less time than all the others. And of course, it's scored on the same scale from 118 to 132. I'll add that a lot of universities and med schools look for a score above 128 as being competitive. So there are a lot of question types within the CARS section. So from, I guess, easiest to most difficult for most students is we start with foundations of comprehension. And so foundations of comprehension questions are fairly simple and they are very broad. So are you able to retrieve ideas from a text, and are you able to understand the main idea of a passage? For example, if the passage is about 18th century literature, can you figure out what the theme is or what the author is broadly arguing? Then we have reasoning within the text questions, which require you to use evidence within the text to support or weaken something and understand how that evidence plays into the author's argument. And then, of course, you have to relate this evidence to the text in the question. And then lastly, we have reasoning beyond the text questions. And these questions are widely considered the most daunting and somewhat annoying questions. It's those sorts of questions where you're between two options and don't know what's correct. But basically, you have to apply the evidence in the passage in text to new situations, right? And assess the effects of new info that might be presented in a question on the passage evidence and on the main idea that was presented by the author. So that's a quick overview of the various question types. There is a wide variety of content, and there's a reason I put an asterisk here is because you're obviously not going to go through each of these subjects and become an expert in them. It would not be worth your time, and frankly, it would take a lot of time. But it's still good to know generally what CARS will test you on so that you're prepared, right? And it's also worth noting that some of these concepts overlap with science, right? Psychology, sociology. And it's tricky because you're not allowed to bring outside knowledge into CARS, right? So you sort of have to leave that at the door. And actually, prepping for each of these content areas might be to your detriment because you might begin to answer questions based on your own knowledge as opposed to knowledge in the passage. All right, so without a further ado, some success strategies for CARS. So first of all, I really want to highlight growth mindset. A lot of people seem to think that CARS is sort of a measure of baseline intelligence, or that it's somewhat of an IQ test, and you really cannot improve at it. But the reality is that CARS is tied to two things: your ability to read, and also your ability to find evidence to support an answer. And that is what CARS is at its very heart. You need to find a very strong piece of evidence in a passage and find a way to connect that to the question and answer it. And when you look at it from that lens, the answer choices almost are black and white. And that's why it's very much possible to improve at CARS. These are some of the skills required for CARS. Some of these fairly obvious: reading speed, time management, process of elimination, critical thinking, and of course, comprehension. So a few approaches. There's the passage-focused approach, which means you read the passage first, and then you answer the questions. There's the question-focused approach, which means you read questions and then try to find the answers by reading the passage. And then there's the hybrid approach. So you sort of skim the passage really quickly, get the main idea, attempt some questions, and then go back as needed. All right, so this is my approach. This is sort of what worked for me. And it depends, right? If you're really, really good at reading, it might be good. If you're not, then maybe it's not for you. But what I would do is I would try to read the passage in 2 to 3 minutes. And my main goal here was to have a main idea for each paragraph, a broad structure for each paragraph, one sentence, and then know the main idea for the entire passage. Now, many times you can figure this out by looking at the title of the paper at the bottom, but I wouldn't rely on that completely. But you should know the main idea and the author's arguments. I personally liked highlighting dates and names because they're tricky to memorize. It's not the easiest thing to have stick in your memory. So highlighting that can be very useful. If you feel like highlighting the main idea of a paragraph in each case is useful, you can also do that. And then for answering questions, I pretty much would ask myself, what piece of evidence in the passage is this question asking about? And then I would sort of use that piece of evidence as a filter to eliminate answer options until I found the correct one. So here's some buzzwords that you might need to know. These words sort of are turning point words. They point you towards an answer. Some of them are incredibly strong words. For example, exclude or preclude, or some of them are positive words. Some of them are negative words. I can't go through each one, but feel free to take a screenshot. All right, so when it comes to reviewing practice tests and passages, I believe that quality is more important than quantity for CARS practice. So for every subject, or so for every question that you answer, whether you got it right or wrong, or whether you flagged it, I think it's very important to understand why you got it right or wrong, and really try to pinpoint what piece of evidence it was in the passage that helped you answer that question and why you made the mistake that you did. Were you in a time rush, or did you not understand the evidence properly, or did you bring in external information? And so there are a lot of common mistakes, right? Glossing over the text, not using process of elimination, and also not practicing under test conditions. And a really big one with CARS is that people sometimes end up answering based on vibes or based on what the passage feels like is correct. And I would advise against this because, again, it's not an evidence-based approach. You might get some questions right, but the issue is vibes are very subjective. And it's actually how you end up with this feeling of not knowing how to pick between two answer options. In reality, these are all one mistake, right? So not being able to find a really strong piece of evidence for your answer sort of is the encompassing underlying factor for all of these mistakes. And so that's really what we want to focus on. So without a further ado, what I'd like to do is just do a CARS booster walkthrough. I'd like to say that there are a few free passages on booster prep, and you're free to do those in your spare time. But here is the link for the practice passage. I will stop sharing and go to the actual practice test interface, and then I will send this link in the chat. You're also free to scan the practice passage with the QR code. All right, I have sent the link in the chat. Oh, all right. Can everybody see the link or? All right. I will go to the practice passage. All right. Hopefully everybody can see the practice passage. So this is 5 questions, and I'll read through the passage, sort of go through what's in my head while I'm reading, and then answer the questions through process of elimination. So right off the bat, I'd scroll all the way down to the bottom, try to figure out what the passage is about. And it seems that it's about morality and moral life. So sort of I want to keep that in the back of my head, try to just brace for the topic. And I'll start reading. So there are 2 positions in ethical theory for which no satisfactory interpretation of immorality consistent with its phenomenal manifestations in experience can be reached. One of these positions is that of extreme individualism in 2 forms, egoism and utilitarianism. The perplexity of both these theories when confronted with the problem of evil is evidence against them. So the first paragraph is sort of telling us what the author is going to talk about. And one tip is that the last sentence of the first paragraph very often is the thesis. And so the author is essentially saying that there are 2 theories of morality: individualism, so I guess focusing on the individual, and universalism, focusing on everybody. And the issue is that on the extreme of both of them, they aren't able to confront the problem of evil. And that's why they're no good. So that's, I guess, sort of the thesis of the first paragraph. For the second paragraph, so for egoism, now we're going into egoism. To set aside one's own interest is always an act of resignation, wherein the individual will does violence to those natural impulses which, as the sole forces governing it, are essentially justifiable. When such an act is demanded by society and its organizations, the demand is a mere exertion of brute force against the individual will, justified only by its conduciveness to the majority of egoistic interests. So essentially, it's saying that when you are completely dictated by your own interests, right, whether or not those interests are moral or not, are sort of justified by the interests of everybody, right? And so even in its motives, crime is merely a case of faulty adaptation to ends. So, for example, someone is born in a lower socioeconomic status, they might commit a crime to get food. It is not real guilt for which the social will not only can injustice, but ought to exact atonement from the sinner. So this entire second paragraph is essentially talking about how egoism, which is a form of extreme individualism on its own, is not enough to justify morality, because all it is essentially doing is comparing a singular person's interests to the welfare of the whole. And that in and of itself is not enough, right? Because we miss out on things where maybe guilt isn't involved, but someone was, trying a faulty adaptation to their end. All right, third paragraph. Utilitarianism, like egoism, makes the immorality of bad motives to consist wholly in their inutility. It differs from egoism because it has a more comprehensive moral end, the welfare of the whole. Hence, it regards immorality as a striving after individual welfare exclusively, and morality as being essentially an endeavor to promote the general welfare. So the distinction between the moral and immoral is purely quantitative. Essentially, how many singular people can we help at a time, right? What policies can we implement so that as many people are helped as possible? And so it might be doubted whether, the scope of actions taken is for the general welfare or for the individual, right? Because you could do something that's good for you and good for a lot of people, but do we really know if that's enough, right? And that's a pretty good argument. And then finally, the author talks about universalism. So extreme universalism considers all individual motives as relatively indifferent factors. Where they oppose the social will, they may be left out altogether. Thus, immorality becomes a mere negation of morality, a nullity that has no place in the infinite process of the moral spirit. So a lot of fancy language, but the author is saying that universalism disregards individual will, and it's only about, the social will, the collective will. And essentially what ends up happening is that immorality is just nothing more than a negation. And that's all it does. Sorry, my cat's getting in the way. All right, so that's sort of the third paragraph. It talked about utilitarianism, but then also told us why universalism, extreme universalism, is no good. Last paragraph, hence, both these extreme positions fail to do justice to that profound antithesis which pervades all the motives of human action. And so this is sort of the thesis of the last paragraph, is essentially when you look at the motives of human action, neither extreme can actually explain all of them. And so it's easy to see why this should be so, for according to the one view, only the individual will is real, and to the other, only the social will. And if either of these alternatives were true, then as a matter of fact, since the ultimate spring of immorality is egoism, the distinction between good and evil would either be reduced to a matter of quantity. So essentially, both of these on their own cannot be true. All right. But the individual and the social will are equally real. So now the author is essentially saying that they're both important, right? We need both of them. The latter may surpass the former in moral worth and in comprehensiveness, but not in reality. For if we do away with the individuals, the whole disappears, right? So if you stop caring about individual people, then what's the point of caring about everybody? On the other hand, it is equally evident that there's no such thing as an isolated consciousness. So individuals alone aren't enough because we live in society and man's whole psychical existence is bound up in society. So what was this passage really about? Well, it's talking about how, extreme individualism and extreme universalism on their own are never enough to actually explain human morality. And there are various reasons for that. But the author's main argument here is that you need both of them to explain human behavior. They're both important. They both explain certain parts of human behavior, and they have to work together. So now that we have a good understanding of the passage, I'd like to go to question 1. Which of the following statements is the most reasonable conclusion that can be drawn from the author's description of extreme individualism? So, option A, extreme individualism undermines the social will. So where did we really talk about individualism? Well, it was in the second and third paragraph where we talked about egoism and utilitarianism, right? And so it's saying that individualism undermines the social will. But we know that individualism essentially ignores the social will, right? When you're individualistic, you only care about yourself. You don't really care about the social will. And this is why it's very important to look at extreme words. Undermine essentially means, to sabotage or to counteract or to get in the way of. And nowhere in this passage does the author really say that that's happening. It just says that individualists don't care, right? And that's very different. So A must be wrong. Option B, it portrays individuals as being driven by lawless behavior. Well, we know this isn't true because in the very first passage, we talk about how, these actions are justified, right? individual actions are in their own interests. If I, do something that benefits me, that was justified in my mind. That's not really lawless or, weird behavior. It is justified to some degree. And more importantly, the author never claims, right, that individualism is lawless. So option B is incorrect. And the biggest thing to note with option B is that it's trying to see if you're going to bring in external knowledge, right? Are you going to try to sort of add in yourself that individualism must be lawless? Option C, extreme individualism precludes individuals from engaging in truly moral actions. Again, there is a very strong word, preclude. But nowhere in the passage does the author say that people who are individualistic can't be moral, right? The author says both are necessary to explain morality, individualism and universalism, right? On both extremes, they have some explanation, but together they're complete. So C cannot be correct. And that must mean that option D is the correct answer. And option D, we can just check it over. In both of its forms, the social will dictates which behaviors are considered immoral. And this is absolutely true. So for egoism, the demand is a mere exertion of brute force against the individual will. This is pretty strong, justified only by its conduciveness to the majority of egoistic interests. And so it's basically saying individual will is only justified by its conduciveness to the majority, right? So when we're talking about individual will, we're sort of comparing it to the social will, to the broad majority of people and their opinions. And that's what determines whether it's immoral. So question 1, answer option is D, and we can clearly see strong passage evidence here. And also for utilitarianism, we can see similar strong evidence. It was talking about quantitative. So here it talks pretty clearly about how whether or not your individual actions and their scope is justified by, the general welfare, right? It's using this general welfare as a comparator to understand individual actions. And so in both forms of individualism, the social will dictates which behaviors are immoral. All right, question 2. Suppose that in a time of crisis, a policymaker influenced by extreme universalism proposes a law requiring all citizens to donate 50% of their income to fund defense projects. The policymaker argues that individual financial struggles are irrelevant and that prioritizing the collective safety is morally justifiable. So right off the bat, the policymaker is extremely universalist, right? He doesn't care, or they don't care about individual struggles. So how might the author respond here? Well, we already know the author is against the extremes, right? The author supports having both universalism and individualism. So anything that sort of supports this policy has to be a wrong answer. We know that right off the bat. So we can automatically cross out A and B because they support this decision, and the author would never be okay with that. What I will say is B says that author would only support the official's decision if determined by a public vote. Once again, the author never talks about voting, and the author really never talks about how we would combine individualism and utilitarianism. This is not in the passage. And so answering the question based on that would not be a good idea because it's outside knowledge. Option C, the author would disagree, as disregarding individual motives undermines the essence of morality. And this is, I think, the correct answer, but we can go through option D. Suggest that the policymaker's decision is practically necessary, but not morally justifiable. And this option is obviously wrong because, again, the author doesn't talk about what's practical or what's practically necessary. Nowhere is that mentioned in the passage. The author sort of talks about philosophy and morality in general. And so this is bringing in external knowledge. And additionally, the author never says that we can completely disregard individual motives, right? He says pretty clearly that both extreme positions fail to do justice to motives that pervade human action. So he would certainly disagree with this extreme view. All right, question 3. Let me just exit and restart the tab. All right, what relationship does the author imply between the individual will and the social will? So this question is asking pretty a basic comprehensive question. What is the author talking about when he talks about the individual and the universal? So option A is saying that the individual will is meaningful only when it aligns with the social will. And this option doesn't seem right. The reason being, in the 4th paragraph, we talk pretty clearly about how they can conflict, right? So it says, both the individual and social will are equally real. The latter may surpass the former in moral worth and in comprehensiveness. On the other hand, it's equally evident that there's no such thing as isolated consciousness. So essentially the author's saying that in some cases, one surpasses the other. In other cases, the other one sort of wins out. It's sort of a mixed bag, and it's not completely conformist. The author isn't saying that we should conform one to the other. So A is wrong. Option B, the individual will and the social will hold the same moral significance. And this is a bit of a tricky option, so we'll come back to it. It seems sort of right. And then option C says the individual will and the social will work together to determine moral development. So for option B, we know that they don't hold the same moral significance necessarily, right? We know that the latter may surpass the former in moral worth, for example, as clearly stated in the passage. So option B is probably not right. Option C says they should work together. And this, I think, is very clearly supported by the passage. Essentially, at the very beginning here, talks about how both extreme positions cannot do justice to human motives and try to understand human motives. You sort of need both of them together. And so option C is pretty strongly supported. Option D, the conflict between the individual will and social will requires that one takes precedence. Again, the author never says one is better than the other. He says that one has certain benefits, but the other also has benefits, right? So social will is more important in moral worth, but individual will is also important because you can't have social will without individual will. So option D is not correct. So option C is the correct answer. All right, question 4. According to the author, ethical theories based on extremes, and we're asked to sort of draw the author's main idea from the passage. So option A, are acceptable so long as they exist in harmony. This is a bit of a distractor. The word harmony sort of makes it feel like these ethical extremes always have to agree with each other. But the author, again, doesn't say that. We've overused this piece of evidence, but really it is useful, right? The author is very clear about differentiating the two and how they're very different. So A is likely not correct. Option B, fail to properly account for all forces that govern morality. Now, this should automatically send a light bulb in our head because, again, this first sentence talked about how neither of them is enough to justify human motives and morality. So B sounds correct. Option C, are themselves created from immoral thinking and thus invalid. This one is outside info, right? Nowhere in the passage does the author say that these philosophies are immoral at their heart, right? The author believes that it's sort of just one part of the picture. We need both of them. So this is not supported by any passage evidence and is just outside information. Option D, lack a standard method of classifying any given action as immoral. And again, First of all, the author never talks about, a lack of classification as being an issue with either of these theories. And also, the author sort of agrees that they need to work together, that, classification in and of itself is not important. The author isn't living in that black and white. He's sort of in the gray area. And so option D is also not correct. So option B makes the most sense because we want these two theories to work together and to account for all the forces that govern morality. All right, question number 5. Which of the following findings about societies that implement extreme ethical theories, if true, would contradict the author's argument? All right, so these ones, you certainly have to figure out a way to either contradict or find evidence to support the statement. So option 1, societies obeying egoism hold individuals accountable for criminal activities. All right, so does this contradict the author's argument? Well, the author is essentially saying that, individualism is when we only care about individual motives and actions. So option 1 is essentially saying the same thing. An individual commits a crime and we care about that crime. We hold that individual accountable, right? And it's really not anything about the social will. It's about that individual and what they did. So 1 certainly contradicts the author's argument. Option number 2, societies taking a utilitarian approach provide tax cuts to employers who invest in environmentally sustainable practices. And this seems exactly like it contradicts the author's argument, because the author's essentially saying that utilitarian practices sort of are extreme and cannot result in collective social good. And this option is showing that, we can give tax cuts to individual people, such as employers, but also have a reward so that it benefits everybody, right? So this is combining sort of utilitarianism and the betterment of the social will and the general welfare, right? So it contradicts the author's argument that utilitarianism on its own can't benefit other people. So 2 is definitely correct. So I'll cross off A and I'll cross off C. All right, so option 3. Societies following a universalist perspective assign individuals to occupations based on assessment of their natural aptitudes. All right, so essentially, this sort of aligns with the author's argument. Why? Because it's fairly individualistic, right? We care about the individual here. We care about their we don't care about the individual here. We care about their natural aptitude, but we don't really care if the individual is interested in doing that thing, right? The individual will doesn't matter. They're sort of given a cookie cutter test that will place them into an occupation. So we only care about how they fit into that larger piece, that universalist perspective. And the author makes the argument that that's what a universalist perspective does. They don't care about individual will. They care about, the entire general welfare and how individuals fit into that. So option 3 aligns with the author's argument and is incorrect. And so with that, we've completed the practice passage. So option B here is the correct answer. So hopefully you got something out of this. One thing I really want to stress is that CARS really likes using the same pieces of evidence again and again and again and again. So here, I think for 2 or 3 of these questions, we only use these 2 sentences, right? And so I think when you find a piece of evidence, highlighting it is useful. But really, these 2 pieces of evidence really touch on the author's main argument, right? That 2 extreme positions can't account for general welfare and general explanation of human morality. And also that, these 2 extremes are different. They might not be exactly the same. They're not conforming, but they should work together, right? That's sort of the point of the entire passage. And these 2 sentences serve as, I guess, evidence of that. They're very strong evidence, and they help us eliminate options and find the correct answer. And so that's sort of how I look at CARS and how I approach CARS passages. Hopefully you got something out of this. And with that being said, I will now move back to the presentation and talk a bit about DAT. All right, so I'll begin with an overview of DAT RC. So the first thing I'd like to talk about is just the section in general. So there are 50 questions, there are 60 minutes. So again, it's much more of a time crunch, right? And the passages are also longer. So it's approximately 2,000 word passages and 16 to 17 questions per passage. I guess a benefit is that these passages are scientific as opposed to CARS. So it's easier for someone with a science background to digest, as most pre-meds do have a scientific background. But again, it's a time crunch. And there are, I guess, two main question types. There's foundations of comprehension. So this is very similar to CARS, right? Retrieving ideas from the text, understanding basic facts. Then there's critical thinking, right? So again, author's tone, understanding the main idea of the passage. But what I really want to emphasize is that DAT is really about finding specific facts in the passage, right? With CARS, it's sort of difficult to find that one piece of evidence that supports the answer, and that can make things tricky. With the DAT, it's fairly easy. It's sort of in broad daylight, and it's a matter of, can you find it in time? Because there is a massive time crunch. So DAT RC is certainly more of a test of reading ability. Some strategies. So there's search and destroy. And again, you can read more about these on Booster Prep. But read the question first and then quickly skim the passage to find the answer. So essentially, you're only looking at the question and then looking at the passage just to find the answer. If you get anxious during the test, it's possible that you might tunnel vision and you might never find that answer in time. And that's sort of a scary thought. So that's one thing to keep in mind, right? The second strategy is you can skim first, then answer. So skim the passage super quickly, answer questions, and then look back at the passage if necessary. And this might favor people who have a better short-term memory because they can read sort of a lot of text and have a lot of the main ideas and concepts just stick in their brain from the get-go, and it might favor them. What the strategy I used was a mixture of both. So I would read the first question, and then I would just start reading the passage normally. I wouldn't really skim it. I'd read it normally at a fairly quick pace, but I would read the entire thing. And until I found that answer, I'd keep reading. Once I found that answer, I'd answer the question. And then I'd go to the next question. And generally, I'd be about 1/4 or halfway through the passage. And sometimes the next question I already knew the answer to. And if I did, then I'd click the answer, move on. But if I didn't, I'd go back, look at the passage, and keep reading until I found the answer to that question. And what I realized really quickly is that this strategy reduces anxiety because you're always answering questions and you're also always reading the passage, right? And because you're reading the passage a bit at a time, your short-term memory only has to remember, the last 500 words. And so if you get the first two questions near the start of the passage, which often happens, you can answer them pretty quickly. Another strategy, some of you may have heard of this, is you can use the method of loci to memorize facts while reading. Essentially, this involves taking a location you're familiar with and taking facts and placing them as images in that location. You're free to search this up and read more about it. All right, so some practice. Now, DAT passages are 2,000 words long, and I'm not going to sit here and read the entire thing, but I do want to give you a feel for what the questions are like. So here's a question from a free practice test on Booster. According to the passage, what is the primary means by which HIV is spread? So we can start reading the passage. Although global commitment to control the HIV/AIDS pandemic has increased significantly in recent years, the virus continues to spread with alarming speed. And then it says the transmission of HIV can occur through 3 mechanisms. It lists them. And then it says, however, sexual intercourse is the predominant mode of transmission. And there you go. You have your answer already. It's clear as daylight. There's no fancy language, fancy wording. It's sort of written in very direct scientific language. And you just know that the answer is B, right? You don't really have to debate or try to understand anything else. You just click the answer, move on. Now, again, you can obviously see if this was further down in the passage, it might cause some anxiety, right? You might be like, I can't answer this first question for the life of me. And that causes anxiety, causes you to, second guess yourself. And that's what makes DAT RC difficult, is the incredible passage length and the time crunch. All right, second question. This question is sort of a critical thinking question. So based on figure 1, which region demonstrates the most significant inverse relationship between the volume of HIV cases and the percentage retrieving antiretroviral therapy? And so there are a lot of questions that are based on figures, and these are sort of nice because figures are very prominent, right? You just scroll to figure 1 really, really quickly. It's not like finding a word or finding a sentence. And you find the figure and you interpret it. Again, not much debate because it's science, right? So here we see that the people living with HIV in millions is on the left, and the amount that have antiretroviral therapy coverage on the right. And you can clearly see that in sub-Saharan Africa, unfortunately, there are a lot of people living with HIV, but there is very little antiretroviral therapy coverage. That's a very stark contrast there. And that essentially demonstrates that inversely proportional relationship, right? If you don't have that antiretroviral coverage, your HIV rates will spike. So again, sub-Saharan Africa is the correct answer. And it's nice, you sort of just see the bar graph being so prominent and large. You could almost answer this question without even reading the axes. I don't recommend that you do, but just goes to show how much easier the questions are. All right, last question. Which of the following percentages represent the reduction in mother-to-child HIV transmission when nevirapine is administered during labor? And so we would, I guess, keep reading the passage. And then question 9, successes also include the development and effective use of highly sensitive and specific HIV screening tests, which have virtually eliminated the infection. In addition, the administration of a short course of nevirapine to mothers during labor and to newborns postpartum reduces the risk of mother-to-child transmission by as much as 47%. And another way you could really find the answer to this question is, the answer is a number, and you can use that to your advantage, right? Just slowly scroll through and look for numbers. And once you find a number, read the surrounding context behind it. And if it's the correct context, pick that number. So a lot of these questions, can be gamed. And I would certainly advise, if it works for you, skipping through and trying to find questions that are easier first, or maybe questions that are asked on the earlier part of the passage that you're reading, and try to answer those. Again, this is dependent on reading ability and exam nerves, and everybody is different. So I hope that helped you get a feel for the DAT RC section. Again, questions are much easier, and we'll go through a comparison here. So DAT RC, the questions themselves, much, much easier, right? MCAT CARS is just considered uniquely scary, uniquely difficult, and very hard to improve on. With DAT RC, there's a time crunch, and there is with MCAT CARS too. But with DAT RC, it's uniquely a test of time crunch, right? You have a very, very long section, and you have 60 minutes for 50 questions, right? So it's very, very quick, as opposed to CARS, where you have 90 minutes for 53 questions. Those questions are more difficult, and time is a factor. But the hardest part about DAT RC is the time crunch. So DAT RC requires really quick skimming and finding facts quickly. And what I like to describe this as is essentially you are control Fing. So if you control F, you can find any word in a passage or in a paragraph, but on the DAT, you're not allowed to do that for obvious reasons. And you have to be a human control F. You have to find it yourself. So it's a very sort of robotic job. With CARS, you have to find the strongest passage evidence, right? And that requires time, that requires effort to figure out what is supporting the answer choice and finding that golden piece of evidence. With the DAT RC, it's maybe easier to get a high-ish score, right? But really getting a really high score is difficult because the questions are easier. If someone's eyes, just find a certain answer quicker or find a certain fact quicker, right? You can get quite lucky and just finish passages very quickly and get a very high score. And that's why there are a lot of people at the top. There are very few people at the top that actually have that insanely high score because it's a curved exam. And same with CARS. MCAT is a scaled exam, but it's a bit more straightforward, right? It's very straightforward in terms of the amount of raw questions you get correct can generally determine your score. Now, one exam might be very difficult and more questions might be dropped, or one exam might be very easy and might be scaled down, right? And so it can change, but the DAT curve near the top is very difficult to accomplish. DAT RC has more dry passages, I guess. Like they're very factual. They use very basic language. They talk about pretty simple scientific facts, which is a benefit, right? Makes the section easier. MCAT CARS is fairly complicated. It sort of has this flowery language. And as you saw with the CARS passage, it was sometimes difficult to understand the concepts. And then lastly, DAT RC has that basic science content as opposed to humanities and social sciences. And most pre-med students have done science, right? They don't necessarily take arts. There are a lot of non-traditional applicants, but that is the forte of most pre-med students. And so that's what sort of adds to the difficulty of CARS. So that's a sort of quick comparison and rundown of the two sections. And now I am happy to take some questions from the audience.
Great, Pahul. Thank you so much for really running down the process that at least you've made in terms of how you had attacked these types of questions before. We have had some questions kind of coming in, and so let's start off with this one off of our YouTube live stream regarding the DAT or OAT reading comprehension. So outside of test prep, what other practices or habits can help one prepare for the reading comprehension section?
Yeah, really good question. So specifically for the DAT, just having really good baseline reading skill is important, right? So ensure that, you're able to read the passage quickly enough. And one piece of advice I'd give is because the passages are just basic science passages, you can find passages on the internet that mimic them, right? You can get a lot of reading practice and a lot of easy practice. You can just sit on your couch and just read articles. And that can sort of get your brain going in terms of, reading speed and being able to skim the article. Ask yourself, what's the main idea? What are some important facts as you're reading? And that's very useful. And if you've done, some research, you've probably done that a lot. So you can really use a lot of other things to your advantage to help you prepare. And in terms of actual practice, I would highly recommend that you try a lot of different things, because with DAT RC, people's brains work very differently, right? My eyes scan the text very differently than anybody else's. It's not something you can really control. So you should absolutely try every single strategy. I cannot stress enough how much, this is my opinion. But my goal was to present as many as possible. So try everything, try to time yourself, and when you're starting out, maybe don't time yourself, just to see if you can really get those questions correct, if they're easy to you. And once you really get practice, add in that timing element. So that's my advice.
So one of the interesting questions that I know is sort of related to this from my own standpoint is when you obviously are starting from square one, you don't know what practices or habits or strategies really work well for you. So how did you get to the point where you sort of crafted for either test, the strategy that worked best for you? So, obviously, do you read first, or do you read the whole passage first, or do you read the questions? How did you figure out, which one method worked a little bit better than the other?
Yeah, that's a good question. So again, the first time I wrote the MCAT, I, did not do well on CARS, right? I had a fairly low score and didn't get into med school that cycle. So it's difficult. I tried a lot of things that first cycle, a lot of different strategies. But I realized, a few things. Other resources like Booster Prep's resources are incredibly good for practice and understanding logic and improving your speed. So that's number one. If you're practicing, you're trying out new things, use those resources. They're very helpful, right? You want to sort of build up your base. But I think a lot of people know that AAMC resources, because they're created by the test creator, are the most representative. So make sure that whatever strategy you use works well for those AAMC questions and practice tests, right? Because at the end of the day, those are the sorts of questions that are going to appear on your actual MCAT. And so I would say my strategy was to make sure that my strategy works for those questions, right? And I've sort of come to the conclusion that the one underlying thing behind every single passage, or at least in my opinion, is that each option can be supported by one piece of evidence. It's pretty clear. And oftentimes it's the same piece of evidence repeated again and again and again. As we saw with that practice passage, you'll realize if you actually highlight that evidence, it's like 2 or 3 lines that you've highlighted, but somehow they help you get through the entire passage. And so it's cool because that the author's argument can really be boiled down into those few pieces of evidence, and you can use that to your advantage. Now, how you read the passage, how you read the questions, and how you go about finding that evidence can vary from person to person, right? You might find it better to have the question in the back of your head while looking for the evidence, and I completely get that, right? Again, that's personal preference, but I think one thing that is fairly objective is that you need to find a very strong piece of evidence. Yeah.
I was going to wonder, since I think both exams allow for highlighting, how does one practice? Is there a highlighting strategy? I mean, I guess you kind of mentioned a little bit of it for one versus the other. So whether it's like highlighting where you see a piece of evidence or a particular sentence that really pops out of, that could answer obviously a number of the different MCAT questions that are out there. I'm just sort of wondering, what sort of highlighting strategies actually exist out there?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I'll actually answer something else about this too. So we're always taught not to use our finger when we're reading, or not to use the cursor when we're reading. And it's interesting. You actually read faster if you use your cursor or your finger. There's studies to show this. The reason being, your eyes are focused on one point. So I'd actually heavily recommend moving your cursor along while you're reading. It keeps you focused, keeps you zoned in. The other thing I'd really recommend is rote information should always be highlighted, because you're probably not going to remember 1918 or 1930 or random dates. So highlighting that, I think, is almost necessary, and highlighting names also very necessary, because so many questions will say, what was Natasha saying about the author's argument, or what was John saying about the author's argument. So having those names highlighted and really easy to refer back to makes your job a whole lot easier. Now, a few other things that are a bit more, I think, subjective, right? You can highlight the thesis. I think that actually is sort of useful. You can also highlight the main idea of each paragraph. Some people actually write down the main idea of each paragraph. I know some people who've gotten amazing scores with that strategy. But again, there's a trade-off, right? You're taking time to write it down. And I don't know, maybe you want to do that, maybe you don't. But having a roadmap for each paragraph, whether that be in your head or written down, is useful, because it makes it very easy to go directly to the evidence. Instead of having to skim the entire passage again, you go directly to that paragraph about individualism and egoism, and you just have to skim that one paragraph. So yeah, that's my opinion.
Okay. And obviously everyone can play around, but I appreciate you pointing out that no, it actually does help if you did use your hand or you actually use your cursor, because I know people kind of sort of shun that a little bit too. I am definitely the type of person who all of a sudden I just find my whole entire passage is highlighted. So I tend to always have that issue. I know we had a question that that was in the prepared, some questions that we would ask from other people before. And so part of it is about time. And so a little bit is, of course, the stress of the clock and so forth. Just comment a little bit, where's the clock? If you can recall on the real MCAT, on the real DAT, OAT, You took the computer version, not the. I don't know if the Canadian version is it also a computer version? I just don't remember offhand.
Yeah, so both the MCAT and the DAT are computerized now. Yeah.
Okay, so I don't know whether one should notice the clock or should avoid noticing the clock. How does clock management really help, in your opinion, on this side?
That's a great question, and I kind of actually missed that. Apologies. So for MCAT, I would say, very simply, it's a matter of division, right? You have 90 minutes, you have 9 passages. So make sure that every 10 minutes, you're finishing a passage and its associated questions. Now, there's an asterisk there because some passages are long and some are short. Some are 5 questions, some are 7 questions. And so what I would say is if it's a 7-question passage, you took 11 minutes, don't beat yourself up, at least not in the middle of the exam, because that's not good. Just move on. If it's a 5-question passage and you took less time, great. Like that's a boost of, confidence. Some people like doing certain number of question passages first or last. My opinion is that strategy sort of wastes time because you're going to do all of them eventually anyways. But again, that's just my opinion. For DAT RC, you have 60 minutes, you have 50 questions. So the timing is a bit different. You can't really pinpoint exactly how long it's going to take for a question, right? So if your first question is about something that's at the very end of the passage, obviously you're not going to spend like 1 minute, 30 seconds on that question. So it sort of messes with your head because you're like, I'm 3 minutes in and I just can't find the answer. And it's sort of a psychological game with DAT RC. And so I would say try to figure out where your trade-off is and where, skipping to the next question is a valuable decision for you. And the way I judge this is, have you read enough to the point where you know the main idea of the passage? Because if you do and you still haven't answered that first question, just move on because I guarantee you'll find something else you can answer. Or have you read to the point where you found like a fact, like a supporting fact, like that fact about antiretrovirals and nevirapine and the 47% reduction? That's a very core fact, right? And it's a number. Or maybe you found a figure. So if you get to those points and you haven't answered the first question, just move on. Answer the rest, come back to it. And one thing to note with DAT RC is there's a 2-second delay after each question. There's a prometric delay. It's 2 seconds.
Oh, great.
Every time you hit submit, it takes 2 seconds. I don't know why they have it. It doesn't make much sense to me.
Wow.
But that does exist. So please make sure you practice with that delay, right? You don't want to be bamboozled on exam day and realize that you have to wait 2 seconds. So yeah, practice with that delay and then figure out what works for you. Yeah.
Jesus, like you've already lost 2 minutes for the DAT if you did that. Oh my God, that's horrible. Another question, a topic that came in through the prepared group of people who submitted questions was also, sometimes the passages are written and probably, whether it's the science questions, I would probably imagine people can get really distracted. So I think we have a lot of people who tend to lose focus when it comes to reading. And so I don't know what suggestions you or any of your peers have had about how to stay focused as you are looking for the facts, or as you're certainly for MCAT trying to maneuver through all of the thinking that goes on in many of those passages too. How do you stop being distracted?
Yeah, I'll say a few things. So first of all, there are environmental factors. So if you're a person who regularly drinks coffee or tea or something else, you eat something that you use while studying, you absolutely should not quit that. Even if you think it's a bad habit, the day before the exam is not the time to quit that because it will mess with you psychologically. You won't feel the same. So do not do that. The second thing, reading with your cursor helps with focus. In fact, a lot of memory champions, people who sort of memorize and do this for their living, they do that, right? So it's actually a really good strategy. Highlighting helps with focus. Highlighting arguments can help with focus. If you feel like you're wandering off, you might want to consider highlighting and, interacting with the passage. But you could also do what I did, right? While I was reading the passage, I was sort of translating from the author's very flowery language, right, into my own words and trying to figure out, what is the author really saying. And so having that dialogue in the back of your head while you're reading, incredibly important. With the DAT, it's a bit different because most of the questions are just straight facts, right? So being engaged with the material is still important because there are main idea questions, but because it's scientific passage, it's very easy to find the main idea, right? Like the main idea of that last passage, I barely read 2 or 3 sentences, but like it was clearly about the spread of HIV, how antiretrovirals combated it, and various other things, right, related to that. So it's pretty easy to figure that out. And also, one other strategy is figure out the thesis. Generally, the thesis is like the first line of the second paragraph, the second line of the first, or the last line of the first paragraph. And so if you can find that sentence and really ingrain it in your head, that sort of is like a North Star for you to add everything else in the passage to it. And one last thing, think of MCAT CARS as like sort of a piece of slime, right? It's very sticky. It's very like malleable, right? Every time you get a question, you sort of mold it in a different way. Like it really helps to think of it that way. If you get a completely new scenario that you have to apply evidence to, right? Really think about that scenario and how it integrates into the passage, right? And that's actually useful because questions help you stay engaged, right? If you have a question, you're more likely to engage with the material, and that tests comprehension. So it's sort of you sort of help yourself by really trying to understand those questions and how they relate to the passage.
I know we're a little bit over time. I want one little question, just for your opinion. Which did you like taking better, the MCAT or the DAT?
I think I like taking the DAT a lot better. MCAT, I had to retake it. But also the DAT, I sort of, I wanted to have dentistry as like a backup option. That was my goal. And so I honestly didn't study much for the DAT. I only had like a week or 2. And so I kind of just walked in there and gave it my best. And there was no stakes on my head. Somebody who genuinely has a lot of stakes, it's much more difficult. You have stress, you have a lot of things going on. You have to also work on applications and a whole lot of other stuff, Casper, all these other things. On top of that, you have courses. So it's a very difficult situation to be in. Being a pre-med student is probably one of the hardest parts of medical journey, a healthcare journey, or being a pre-dentistry student. So that's my opinion. That's what I found easier or harder. I think, the harder part of the DAT is perceptual ability. That's sort of the equivalent of CARS on the DAT. And perceptual ability is scary. I honestly didn't do that well on it. And I'd argue it's actually much harder than CARS because your eyes work in a certain way no matter what. It's difficult to sort of improve. With CARS, at least you can find that evidence, right? At least the answer's in the passage. You can find it. That's my opinion.
Sure. I appreciate it. And I know for those of you who had other questions, we're sorry we didn't get to that many of them. So thank you for so much for spending the time with us to talk about the strategies for handling these reading tests, the critical thinking tests, and the differences between one versus the other. So I thank very much our partners at Booster Prep for organizing this live stream. And so hopefully, if you have any other questions, please reach out to the Booster Prep team. And thank you so much for being part of our expert advice session here. Thank you so much. Have a good rest of your evening for those of you who are catching us live. For those of you who are catching the replay, have a good rest of your day.
Thank you so much.